I was halfway through explaining a consent exception when Evan Rourke cut me off. "Let's stop pretending this needs to be complicated," he said. The room went still. Monday morning, 10th floor boardroom, 20 people on the call, 2 bankers in person, HR listening with cameras off, and my merger close deck still glowing on the screen behind him. My name is Elena Marquez. I was 41, Senior Director of Contract Governance and Integration Risk at Redwood Analytics, and I had spent 11 years becoming the person this company called when a deal looked clean on paper, but dangerous in real life. Evan had been inside Redwood for 6 weeks. Halcyon Systems was acquiring us, and he was their incoming Chief Integration Officer. He clicked to a reorg chart I had never seen and said, "Going forward, client consents and disclosure tracking will move under Madison Hale." Madison sat beside him, pen ready, expression careful. She was his hand-picked VP. I said, "That process can't be reassigned mid-close without legal control review." He smiled then. Not because he was amused, because he wanted the room watching. "That," he said, "is exactly the legacy drag we are removing." No one spoke. Then he looked at me and finished the job. "Elena, what I need from you now is handoff support, not gatekeeping. We can't carry legacy deadweight into a merger." Legacy deadweight. He said it in front of bankers, executives, my own team, and a live meeting transcript. The humiliation was sharp enough to feel physical. He wasn't just insulting me, he was erasing me in the one room where authority mattered. And he was doing it over slides built from systems I had created. Evan acted like they were just files anyone could run. That was how I knew he did not understand what any of them actually controlled. I kept my face still and said almost nothing. Men like Evan feed on reaction. They throw a blade and wait to see who bleeds in public. So I watched. And because I watched, I caught 3 things. First, the team's transcript icon was on. Every word was being captured. Second, Evan told Madison, "Clean the red flags out of the binder so legal stops slowing us down. Not review them, clean them out." Third, when I said, "My sign-off is required on change of control consent tracking," he gave a short laugh and said, "Not anymore." That was the mistake. My sign-off was not ceremonial. I was the named control owner for change of control consents on Redwood's top client contracts. In simple terms, when a company changes hands, some clients must approve that change in writing. If they do not, they can walk away, renegotiate, or claim breach. Evan thought he was pushing aside a difficult woman. What he was really doing was cutting the brakes on a moving car. When the meeting ended, the room broke apart in that fake calm corporate way people use after a public humiliation they don't want to admit they witnessed. I didn't go to HR. I didn't cry in the bathroom. I went straight back to my office, shut the door, and opened the latest disclosure schedule. Then I pulled the version I had sent on Friday. Side by side, the lie was obvious. 11 clients I had marked written consent required were now green. 8 had been flipped outright. 3 had been softened into low-risk language. A note tied to one of our biggest health data clients was gone completely. That note mattered because the contract was strict. No written approval, no transfer. No transfer, no clean close. This was not formatting. This was not opinion. This was an inaccurate disclosure path dressed up as confidence. I pulled the redline history. I pulled my Friday memo. I pulled the internal control map that named me as owner on consent review. Then I wrote one email to Claire Donnelly, our Deputy General Counsel. I kept it cold. I wrote that the current disclosure schedule appeared inaccurate, that my control role had been removed without transition, and that multiple contracts requiring written consent had been reclassified without support. And I added one more line. Any closing activity based on the altered schedule could create material legal exposure. Then I attached the memo, the transcript excerpt, and the version history, and I sent it. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then, exactly 90 minutes after Evan called me dead weight, a new email hit the executive work stream. Subject line: immediate pause on merger documentation activity. The first sentence read, effective immediately, all merger-related documentation, approval routing, and certification activity are paused pending legal review. Across the hall, 2 office doors opened at once. Someone said, "What happened?" Someone else answered, "Legal froze it." I read the email one more time, locked my screen, and finally let myself think the truth. He had tried to rush a merger through the one system I had built to stop men like him. The freeze email bought me silence, but it did not soften what had happened. It made it clearer. People like Evan always try to make a public insult sound personal, like the problem is chemistry or style or some vague failure to adapt. But what happened in that meeting was not about tone. It was about control. He did not call me dead weight because I was old-fashioned. He called me dead weight because I kept writing down things he wanted hidden. Redwood was not just a place I worked. It was the company I helped steady after one of the worst contract scares in our history. 5 years earlier, a major client nearly walked after an account executive promised a transfer that needed written approval nobody had tracked correctly. On sales thought legal owned it. Legal thought finance had checked it. Finance thought the account team had it. In other words, everybody assumed somebody else was protecting the company. They were wrong. We saved the client, but barely. After that, I built the consent matrix from scratch. That system became my life for the next few years. I mapped contract language line by line. I trained sales, legal, finance, and account leads on what changed hands and what did not. I built escalation rules, timing rules, ownership rules, and review steps simple enough that no one could pretend they did not understand them. I was never the loudest person in the room. I was the woman people forgot until something expensive was about to break, and things were very expensive now. When Halcyon first approached Redwood, our CEO told me in private, "You'll lead contract transition through close. Nobody knows the obligations the way you do." I believed him. I turned down 2 outside calls because I thought staying would matter. I thought competence still bought a little protection. Then Evan arrived. He walked through Redwood like he was touring a house he had already bought. He talked about modernizing old processes and rationalizing decision rights. But every sentence meant the same thing. Remove the people who might slow him down by telling the truth. He had no history here, no scars from the near misses, no memory of why the controls existed. To him, caution looked weak. Documentation looked political. Anyone who said, "That number is too aggressive," became a problem to be managed. That was why his stunt in the meeting mattered so much. He did not just embarrass me. He took away the one gate that kept the deal honest. He made it sound like I was being moved aside because I was outdated, when the truth was uglier. I was being pushed aside because I would not turn known risk into pretty slides. About 40 minutes after legal froze the merger work stream, Madison sent me a message. "Please send latest contract tracker," she wrote. "Need export version only. No comments needed. Will simplify before recirculating." I read it twice. No comments needed. That one line told me everything. They did not want the full file. They wanted the clean-looking version. The one without my notes, warnings, timing issues, client-specific language, or red boxes explaining why consent had to come before close. They wanted my work, minus my witness. I did not answer right away. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and looked through the glass wall of my office at the hallway outside. People were moving in little clusters now. Fast steps, quiet voices, Slack messages lighting up phones. The building had shifted from merger excitement to merger nerves, and I could feel it even without opening my door. That was when the personal sting settled into something colder. I had spent years making myself useful in ways that did not photograph well. I was not the face of the company. I was not the one on conference stages. I was the woman in the background making sure nobody signed something stupid. The kind of woman ambitious men praise in private and erase in public the second she becomes inconvenient. Evan looked at that kind of work and saw weakness. He thought he was replacing me. What he was really trying to do was use my systems after removing the only person who could testify to what they actually meant. The reason I stayed calm was simple. I knew exactly where the truth lived. At Redwood, our biggest contracts were not just PDFs sitting in a folder somewhere. They were loaded with trigger language, side letters, approval requirements, pricing protections, and change of control clauses that could turn a beautiful merger deck into a legal disaster in one afternoon. A change of control clause sounds technical, but it is not hard to understand. If ownership of a company changes, some clients get the right to approve that change first. If they do not approve it, they can delay the transfer, force new terms, or walk away. In normal conversation, people call that a contract detail. In a merger, it is revenue with a fuse attached. The 11 contracts I had flagged were not small accounts. They were some of Redwood's most valuable enterprise clients. Healthcare systems, financial data groups, 2 national logistics platforms, 1 public sector vendor with language so strict it could turn a sloppy disclosure into a board-level crisis by itself. That was why my role existed in the first place. My team did not just store contracts, no matter how many times people outside legal like to talk that way. We tracked the exact clause, the exact approval path, the timing window, the responsible owner, and the risk rank for each client. We kept the kind of records that stopped executives from pretending complicated obligations were simple because simple sounded better in a meeting. The merger disclosure schedule worked the same way. To people like Evan, it was just another spreadsheet attached to the deal. To people who understood what they were signing, it was a truth list. It told both sides what risks existed before money changed hands. If a contract needed consent, the schedule had to say so. If revenue could be delayed, the schedule had to say so. If there was exposure, the schedule had to say so. It was not a formatting exercise. It was a sworn accuracy exercise. That was why him saying my sign-off was not needed anymore mattered so much. He had not just moved me out of a workflow. He had tried to remove the person most likely to say the schedule was false. By lunchtime, I had the full picture. The Friday memo I had circulated was still sitting in my sent folder. Subject line, consent risk review, written approval required accounts. In that memo, and I had marked all 11 contracts clearly. My recommendation had been blunt: written consent before close, or full disclosure plus a holdback to protect against post-close loss. No pretty language, no hiding place. Then I opened the file Madison's team had touched after Evan's late-night call. 8 contracts had been turned green. 3 had been softened to low likelihood issue. And the note on our biggest health data client, the one that specifically said no assignment, transfer, or change in control without written approval, had been deleted. Not shortened, deleted. When I checked the version history, I saw the edits stack up in order. Madison, then a Halcyon deal lawyer, then Madison again. Final save just after 11:40 p.m. That mattered because it killed the most common executive defense: confusion. Confusion is messy. This was clean. Someone had been warned. Someone had changed the file anyway. Someone had decided the risk looked smaller if the person who flagged it was removed. And once I saw that clearly, something inside me settled. I was not chasing revenge because a man humiliated me in a meeting. I was sitting on proof that the merger papers no longer matched the actual contracts. That difference was everything. A hurt employee can be dismissed. A documented gap between legal disclosures and binding client obligations cannot. If Claire did her job, Evan's version of events was never going to survive daylight. And the strangest part was that he still seemed to think this was a personality problem. He thought I was upset because he embarrassed me. He had no idea I was already past anger. I was counting clauses. I was counting client names, approval paths, notice periods, signature rules, and every place his confidence had crossed into exposure. The story he wanted to tell was simple. Old process, new leadership, faster close. The truth was much uglier. He had taken a real legal risk, painted over it, and called that leadership. Once legal froze the work stream, I knew exactly what Evan's next move would be. He would try to make me look emotional. Men like him always do. They throw something reckless into the room, then act offended when the person hit by it starts bleeding. If I raised my voice, I would become unstable. If I vented to coworkers, I would become political. If I sent one angry message, he would call it proof that I could not handle change. So I gave him nothing. I shut my office door, opened a legal pad, and built a timeline. 9:02 a.m. Integration meeting begins. 9:26 a.m. Evan says, legacy dead weight. 9:29 a.m. Evan says my sign-off is not needed. 9:31 a.m. Madison is told to clean red flags out of the binder. 9:44 a.m. I compare Friday's file to the altered version. 9:58 a.m. I email Claire with the transcript excerpt, memo, and redline history. 11:01 a.m. Legal pauses merger activity. Simple, clean, defensible. Then I preserved everything I could before anyone decided certain records no longer needed to be easy to find. I saved the team's transcript while access was still open. I exported the version history for the disclosure schedule. I downloaded my Friday memo, earlier risk logs, and the internal control map approved during merger planning. That map mattered because it named me as owner of the consent review tied to the officer certificate. In plain English, it proved my role was formal, not optional. After that, I pulled older emails, not dramatic ones. The boring ones are always better. I found a note from 3 weeks earlier, warning that transfer assumptions on key accounts were being pushed too hard. Another saying, the client consent review could not be compressed just to match deal timing. Another asking for outside counsel to review 2 clauses before anyone told the board those accounts were clean. Those emails mattered because they predated the reorg. They proved I had not suddenly become difficult after being embarrassed. I had been consistent before Evan ever walked into Redwood. Then I wrote Claire again. This time, I copied Martin Voss, our head of internal audit, and Dana Liu, the board secretary. I wrote that because the integrity of the disclosure schedule might be compromised. Now I was preserving relevant records and formally requesting that no merger certification move forward until ownership of the consent process was reviewed. I added one sentence I knew would matter. If a control owner had been removed after documented risk had been raised, the review should include whether governance procedures had been bypassed. That was not drama. That was procedure sharpened into a blade. Then I took 2 smaller steps that mattered later. First, I documented every request Madison made for my tracker. Her message asking for an export without comments. Her follow-up asking for a cleaner version. Her note saying she only needed final statuses, not working notes. Each one sounded harmless alone. Together, they sounded like someone trying to strip warning labels off a machine before showing it to the board. Second, I called Jonah Pike in client success. Jonah handled 2 of the 11 red flag accounts, and he moved fast when executives pushed him. I told him not to send any revised consent language or transition wording to clients until legal confirmed the approved draft. He asked if something was wrong. I said, something is unresolved. Keep everything on the old versions for now." After a short pause, he said, "Understood." That call mattered because if Evan got desperate, he might try to create cover after the fact. He might claim clients had already been socialized, or that everyone was aligned except me. Keeping Jonah on the old drafts took away one easy path to fake comfort. By late afternoon, the whole office felt different. Smiles were thinner, doors closed faster. Calendar invites moved around. E-merger excitement had turned into quiet nerves. And somewhere inside that tension, I stopped feeling like the woman who had just been humiliated in a conference room. I started feeling like a witness. I did not need to destroy Evan personally. I only needed to keep his paper trail alive long enough for the right room to see it. At 4:12 p.m., Claire replied with a calendar invite. Outside counsel review, mandatory. I read that subject line once, then again, and for the first time all day I knew this had moved beyond hallway politics. Evan was about to have to explain himself to people he could not bully. You would think a legal freeze would make a smart executive careful. It did not make Evan careful. It made him louder. 2 days after the pause, he called a company town hall. Officially, EGIT was to align the organization and reduce noise during integration. In real terms, it was a chance for him to get in front of the story before legal finished reviewing what he had done. I logged in from my office and watched him stand in front of a blue Halcyon slide with his sleeves rolled up like he was about to fix a factory instead of explain a merger problem he had helped create. He smiled and said, "What you're seeing right now is routine diligence noise. Nothing more. Routine diligence noise." Then he thanked Madison by name for modernizing legacy processes and cutting through old bottlenecks. He never said my name, but he did not need to. Everyone in that room knew who the legacy process was supposed to be. Then he added, "Sometimes people confuse ownership with usefulness. Oh, we're focused on what moves the business forward." That line was for me. It was also a mistake. Because every time Evan tried to control the narrative, he made the contrast sharper between what he said in public and what the record already showed in private. The people on the call reacted the way corporate people always do when they know something is off, but no one has been given permission to say it out loud. A few smiled. Most stayed very still. Cameras flicked on and off. Slack messages started moving before the meeting even ended. I could feel the tension through the screen. But the real damage came later. That afternoon, Claire forwarded me a board update deck Evan had circulated to senior leadership and the transaction committee. Buried in the risk summary was one line that made my stomach go cold. 96% of Redwood top contracts transferable without special consent. I knew that number. It had once been true in a very limited, early review sense months ago, before my team finished deeper analysis. It had been a headline number from an old tracker, not a final conclusion. After the second pass review, we had reclassified 11 accounts and updated the exposure language. That older percentage should have died the day my final memo went out. Instead, Evan had pulled it back to life because it sounded clean. That was his pattern. If reality was messy, he reached for the cleaner version, then acted like confidence could make it true. Before I could even answer Claire, one of my analysts, Priya, sent me a screenshot. A Madison had messaged 3 members of my team directly asking them to confirm current green list accuracy ASAP. Not review, not validate against source language. Confirm. 1 click, 1 answer. One more chance to turn pressure into fake consensus. Priya wrote, "I haven't replied. This feels wrong." I called her immediately. "Do not answer from memory," I said, "and do not give anyone verbal comfort. If legal asks for source review, you provide source review, nothing else." She exhaled like she had been holding her breath for an hour. "Okay, I thought so." That was the moment I understood how desperate they were getting. Evan was not just spinning. He was reaching around process and pulling at people who had less rank than I did, hoping one nervous analyst would hand him something he could wave around later. Meanwhile, the rest of the machine was starting to move in ways he could not fully control. Outside counsel turned one review into 3 interviews. Internal audit requested system logs. One of the bankers who had watched Evan humiliate me on Monday emailed finance asking for a revised revenue at risk model if client consents were delayed. That last part mattered more than gossip. Bankers do not ask for downside models when they feel safe. Evan, of course, tried to work the hallways anyway. He told people I was stalling the deal because I could not handle reporting to Madison. He implied I was territorial, emotional, protective of my little empire. I did not chase a single rumor. I let him talk, because every time he opened his mouth, he created one more point of comparison between his story and the documented record. Near the end of the day, Claire sent me the board deck and asked one question. Did you ever authorize this percentage after your final review? My reply was one sentence. No, and I warned the opposite in writing. That was when I knew he was no longer just defending himself. He was building the case against himself in public. By Thursday morning, the problem had outgrown Evan's confidence. That was the first real shift. Up to that point, he could still pretend this was internal friction, a style clash, an overcautious director refusing to adapt. But once legal, finance, clients, and the board started touching the same set of facts, the story changed. It was no longer about whether I had been insulted in a meeting. It was about whether the merger model itself had been built on incomplete disclosure. Outside counsel interviewed me first, and that told me more than anyone's tone ever could. People hire outside counsel when they want facts separated from politics. They do not start with the loudest executive. They start with the person whose records are likely to survive scrutiny. I walked into the conference room with a binder, my laptop, and a timeline that matched every document I had preserved. I kept my voice flat. I explained what a change of control clause was in simple language. I showed the 11 contracts. I showed the Friday memo. I showed the control map naming me as consent owner. Then I showed the version history, where the statuses changed after my warning had already been sent. The lawyers asked tight questions. When did you first raise concern? Before the reorg. Were these classifications tentative? No. Did anyone instruct you to lower the risk? Not in writing, but they removed my sign-off and changed the file. I did not exaggerate. I did not speculate. I stayed inside what I could prove. That restraint mattered. In rooms like that, the calmest person usually sounds the most credible. By midday, the damage began reaching outside the building. One of our healthcare clients flagged revised assignment wording Madison's team had almost sent and asked for direct confirmation from Redwood Legal. Another client, one of the logistics groups, paused a transition call and asked whether the merger timeline had changed. Finance reran the revenue model under a delayed consent scenario and realized something ugly. If only 4 of the 11 accounts slipped, Halcyon missed a key performance threshold tied to how the merger price had been justified internally. That was the moment this stopped being an HR issue forever. A bruised ego does not shake a deal model. Revenue exposure does. Evans still tried to contain it. He told anyone who would listen that the consent issues were theoretical. He said my tracker had always been conservative. He suggested legal was overreacting to language that rarely got enforced, but he was running out of room. Internal audit now had the system logs showing note columns removed and risk labels changed after my written warning. Claire sent a document preservation notice to Evan, Madison, and several others. In plain English, that meant legal no longer saw this as a misunderstanding. It meant nobody was allowed to quietly clean up files, delete chats, or rewrite the story after the fact. For the first time, I saw fear on the other side. Madison stopped speaking in that polished, executive-ready tone and started sounding rehearsed. Her emails became shorter. Her questions became safer. Evan canceled 2 transition meetings that had apparently become awkward now that legal was watching everything. Then, late that afternoon, he sent me a message asking if we could speak privately, just the 2 of us. I stared at it for a few seconds before replying. Please route any questions through legal. That was all. No extra sentence, no emotion, no invitation. He did not answer. An hour later, a calendar invite hit my inbox for Friday morning. Year special board session, transaction risk review. I looked at the attendee list. Claire, outside counsel, internal audit, our CFO, Halcyon's deal lead, our CEO, Evan, and me. Not as support, not as handoff, not as legacy anything. I was being called into the room as the person who could explain exactly how this happened. And once I saw that, I understood something Evan still did not. He thought the worst thing that had happened to him that week was the legal freeze. It wasn't. The worst thing was that the people above him had finally started asking for the truth from someone other than him. By Friday morning, the whole building felt quieter, not calmer, just quieter. That kind of quiet only shows up when people know something serious is about to happen, but nobody knows how much damage is already done. Elevators opened softly. Office doors shut faster than usual. Even the receptionist looked like she was trying not to make noise. I walked into the special board session at 8:55 with my laptop, my binder, and no interest in performing emotion for anyone in that room. The boardroom looked exactly the way it always had. Glass walls, long walnut table, too much polished metal. Coffee set out at one end like this was a normal Friday review instead of a meeting that might decide whether a merger survived intact. Claire was already there. So was Martin from Internal Audit. Our CFO sat near the center with a yellow pad full of numbers. Halcyon's deal lead, Victor Sayeg, was flipping through a packet with the focused irritation of a man who had just realized somebody might have sold him a cleaner story than reality deserved. Our CEO looked tired. Evan sat at the far end of the table with Madison 1 seat over, both of them trying very hard to look composed. It almost worked. Almost. Claire opened the meeting. Her voice was flat and careful. We are here to review disclosed contract transfer risk, related changes to approval controls, and whether the current merger materials remain accurate enough to support closing activity. That was lawyer language, but the meaning was simple. Somebody had to explain whether we were about to sign a deal using paperwork that was no longer telling the truth. Claire nodded to me. Elena, please walk the room through the sequence. I did exactly that. I did not rush. I did not dramatize. I did not look at Evan unless I had to. I started with the basics. I explained what a change of control clause was. Now I explained that some clients require written approval before their contracts can move to a new owner. I explained why that matters in plain English. If those approvals are missing, the merged company can lose revenue, face breach claims, or spend months renegotiating relationships it assumed were already secure. Then I showed the list. 11 contracts, 11 client names, 11 approval paths. I walked the room through my Friday memo, the one that clearly marked those accounts as requiring written consent before close or full disclosure with a financial holdback. Then I showed the Monday meeting transcript. I did not read the whole thing. I only read the parts that mattered. Evan saying legal needed less read in the binder. Evan saying my sign-off was not needed. Evan calling me legacy deadweight. Nobody interrupted. Then I showed the version history. Timestamps, edits, risk categories changing after my warning had already been sent, the deleted note on the health data client, the reclassified accounts, the green statuses that had no written support behind them. Victor from Halcyon stopped turning pages. Our CFO leaned back and took off his glasses. Martin from Audit slid a separate copy of the control map across the table and said, "For the record, the consent review ownership tied to certification remained assigned to Elena's function at the time these edits were made." Claire looked at Evan. "Who authorized removal of the control owner from the merger process?" Evan straightened in his chair. He still had some of that executive smoothness then, but not much. "No one removed legal," he said. "We streamlined an operational bottleneck. Elena's process had become overly conservative." Martin answered before I did. "That is not accurate," he said. "This control is not operational only. It feeds the certification structure. We have the approved mapping." The room shifted right there. Not loudly, but completely. Until then, Evan had still been standing on his favorite defense, the one ambitious people use when facts start closing in. This is just a judgment call. This is style. This is old thinking versus new thinking. Martin took that defense away in one sentence. Now it was governance. Now it was recordable. Now it was dangerous. Victor asked, "Were we provided the updated risk analysis before this percentage was shown to the transaction committee?" Claire answered him, "No." Our CFO looked at Evan and said, "Did you know the 96% figure had been overtaken by later review?" Evan hesitated. Just for a second. That second was enough. He said, "We were still evaluating materiality." I spoke then, still calm. "No. We were evaluating whether to disclose it fully or require holdback. The materiality review came after the risk was already identified." Claire nodded once and slid my Friday memo forward so everyone could see the date. That was the moment Evan started running out of air. He tried one last move. He said I was inflating the issue because I resented the reorg. He said my response to change had become personal. Claire shut that down before I had to. "Elena's written warnings predate the reorganization," she said. "The record reflects that clearly." And that was it. Not a shouting match. Not a dramatic speech. Just fact after fact, each one making him smaller. By the end of the session, the board ordered an expanded legal and audit review, removed Evan from the merger work stream, and required all future consent and disclosure reporting to route jointly through Claire and me. He had walked into that room assuming I was dead weight. He walked out of it as the reason the deal nearly fell apart. Once the board moved, everything that had felt frozen all week started moving fast. That is how power works in corporate life. When the wrong person is in control, even obvious problems can sit untouched while everyone waits for permission to see them. But once the room changes, once the right people decide the facts matter more than the performance, the machine suddenly finds its speed again. Evan was placed on leave that afternoon. Officially, it was pending review. Unofficially, everyone knew what it meant. His calendar vanished from the integration workstream before the day was over. By the middle of the next week, he was gone entirely. No farewell note. No polished internal message about his next chapter. Just absence. Madison lasted a little longer, but not in the role she wanted. She was pulled out of consent and disclosure work immediately and reassigned away from the merger core. She had built her short rise on proximity to Evan's confidence. Once his confidence turned into documented exposure, there was nothing underneath it strong enough to hold her up. The merger itself did not die. That part mattered to me. I did not want chaos. I did not want Redwood burned down just so I could feel vindicated. I wanted the truth forced back into the deal, and that was exactly what happened. The Halcyon had to accept revised disclosure language, a holdback tied to the 11 contracts, and a slower integration timeline built around actual consent risk instead of imagined convenience. In plain terms, they had to pay for the risk they had tried to pretend was not there. They had to structure the transaction around the warnings Evan called dead weight. That was the humiliation he deserved, not a dramatic firing scene. Not security walking him out in front of everyone. Something better. The deal survived him by admitting I had been right. A day after the board session, Claire asked me to come by her office. She closed the door, handed me a draft letter, and said, "The board wants you to stay through close as Executive Director of Integration Controls, reporting jointly to Legal and the Transaction Committee." I read the letter once, then set it down. A week earlier, I might have said yes on the spot. I might have heard it as validation and let relief do the rest. I did not make that mistake. "I'll need the reporting line, authority, retention payment, non-retaliation language, and control ownership stated clearly," I said. Claire gave me a small smile. "I assumed you would." That was one of the few moments all week that felt almost warm. Because I was no longer negotiating from gratitude. I was negotiating from proof. I wanted formal credit for the system I had built. I wanted written authority over the disclosure schedule. I wanted protection from anyone deciding, 6 months later, that the easiest way to clean up the history was to push me quietly out after I had saved the transaction. For once, vague respect was not enough. They put it in writing. And yes, there was personal vindication too. The same executives who had gone silent when Evan humiliated me now asked for my view on client sequencing, risk disclosures, and close timing. They did not suddenly become better people. I never tell this story that way. Institutions rarely change their soul in 1 week. What changed was simpler and more useful. They were forced to deal with reality on my terms. That was the real win. 2 weeks later, I walked back into the same conference room for the revised merger review. The screen at the front showed the updated agenda. My name was listed as control lead. Claire sat beside me. Victor from Halcyon was quieter now, more careful. The new materials reflected the 11 contracts correctly. The holdback language was in place. The risk section finally looked like something written by adults instead of salesmen. And Evan's seat was empty. No one called me legacy anything. No one asked me to provide handoff support. No one laughed when I spoke. I opened the revised consent schedule, looked around the table, and began the meeting the way it should have begun the first time, with the truth in plain view. I was never dead weight. I was the part of the company that kept reckless men from signing lies in expensive suits.